Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little earthy, a little strange, and very, very medieval. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back to a time when medicine was less about sterile white coats and more about dried plants hanging from rafters, suspicious powders in little jars, and the occasional frog tied to your wrist because, well, why not? This is the hidden world of the medieval herbalist's apothecary, a place that smelled like a mix of rosemary, mold, and regret. A place where you could buy a cure for your headache, your heartbreak, or your neighbor's sudden case of demonic possession. And yes, sometimes those cures worked. Other times, not so much. Let's ease into it. The medieval apothecary was not your modern pharmacy. No fluorescent lights. No cheerful cashier asking if you'd like to sign up for a rewards card. Instead, picture a dim, cramped shop. Wooden shelves sagging under the weight of jars filled with dried leaves, roots, and powders. Some labeled, some not. Because labeling was for people who didn't trust their memory, and medieval herbalists were nothing if not confident. The air was thick, not just with the smell of herbs, but with the sense that half of these remedies were based on equal parts tradition, superstition, and sheer guesswork. And yet, people came. Because what else were you going to do when your tooth ached in the year 1320? Dentistry was basically hope it falls out on its own. Let's talk about the herbalists themselves. These were not glamorous figures. No one was writing epic poems about the guy who sold you powdered nettle for your stomach cramps. But they were essential. They were the middle ground between learned physicians, who mostly treated the wealthy and spoke in Latin, and the local wise women, who might cure you with a poultice or curse your cow if you annoyed them. The apothecary was practical. They stocked what people needed. Remedies for fevers, ointments for wounds, tonics for digestion, and, of course, the occasional love potion. Because human priorities have always been consistent: health, wealth, and romance. Now, let's float over to the herbs themselves. Take rosemary. Today, it's something you sprinkle on roasted potatoes. Back then, it was practically a miracle plant. Memory problems. Rosemary, bad breath. Rosemary, evil spirits lurking around your bed. Rosemary, it was the medieval equivalent of duct tape, good for everything. Then there was sage. The name literally comes from the Latin salvare, meaning to save, which tells you how highly it was regarded. People thought sage could prolong life, cure snake bites, and even help with fertility. Basically, if you weren't growing sage in your garden, were you even trying? And of course, garlic. Always garlic. Not just for flavor, but for protection. Against illness, against infection, and, naturally, against vampires. Because if you lived in a drafty stone house in the 14th century, you had bigger problems than cholesterol. But here's the thing. For every herb that actually had some medicinal value, there were plenty of remedies that were, let's say, less convincing. For example, if you had a fever, one suggestion was to write the word abracadabra on a piece of parchment, in a triangle that got smaller and smaller, and then wear it around your neck, because apparently fevers could read, and would get confused by the disappearing letters. Or, if you had gout, you might be told to boil a live hare, cut it open, and wrap the warm flesh around your foot, which sounds less like medicine and more like a medieval prank. Let's pause here and appreciate the sheer confidence of medieval medicine. People didn't just dabble, they committed. If you were told to drink a concoction of wine, honey, and powdered emeralds, you did it. Never mind that emeralds are not exactly digestible. If it was prescribed, it must be good. And yes, powdered gemstones were a thing. Rubies, sapphires, even diamonds. Because if you were rich enough to grind up your jewelry and swallow it, why not? At the very least, it showed off your wealth. Oh, you're drinking nettle tea. Cute. I'm sipping liquefied sapphire. Now, let's drift into the darker side. Because of course there was one. Apothecaries weren't just selling harmless herbs. They also stocked poisons. Sometimes openly, sometimes discreetly. After all, if you could sell a cure, you could also sell a way to make someone very, very sick. And in the cutthroat world of medieval politics, that was a valuable service. Arsenic was a favorite. Tasteless, odorless, and effective. It was called the inheritance powder because it had a way of speeding up the transfer of property from one generation to the next. Convenient if you were impatient. But let's not get too grim. Let's float back to the everyday. Imagine walking into an apothecary shop. You'd see bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars filled with powders of every color, mortar and pestles worn smooth from years of grinding, maybe a few animal parts, dried lizards, powdered antlers, the occasional mummified frog, because why not throw a frog into the mix? The apothecary would greet you, probably with a mix of genuine concern and the hope that you were about to spend a lot of money. You'd describe your ailment. He'd nod wisely, maybe stroke his beard, and then rummage through his shelves until he found just the right concoction. Whether it worked or not was another matter. But you'd leave with something, and sometimes that was enough. And here's the thing, some of it did work. Willow bark, for example, was used for pain relief. It contains salicin, which is basically the natural precursor to aspirin. So when you chewed on willow bark for your headache, you were actually onto something. Same with poppy. The seeds and sap were used for pain relief and sedation, which, again, makes sense. Opium has been around for a long time. The medievals didn't fully understand it, but they knew it worked. So it wasn't all nonsense. It was a mix. A strange, fascinating blend of genuine medicine, hopeful superstition, and outright quackery. So, let's wander back into that little shop. The apothecary's counter wasn't just a place for transactions, it was a stage. Behind it, the herbalist was part scientist, part salesman, and part mystic. He, or sometimes she, would measure out powders with a gravity that suggested this was no ordinary handful of dried leaves. This was medicine. This was knowledge. And, if you were lucky, it was also not going to kill you. The tools of the trade were simple. A mortar and pestle for grinding, scales for weighing, wooden spoons for stirring, and a lot of jars. Jars of every size, filled with substances that ranged from the familiar, like mint leaves, to the questionable, like powdered mummy. Yes, actual mummy. Imported from Egypt, ground up, and sold as a cure for just about anything. Because apparently, nothing says health like sprinkling a little ancient corpse dust into your wine. Let's pause on that for a moment. Mummy, powder. It was called mumia, and it was wildly popular. People believed it had healing properties, probably because it was exotic and expensive. And if you're paying a fortune for something, you want to believe it works. It's the medieval version of buying overpriced supplements online. Of course, the supply of actual mummies wasn't infinite. So, unsurprisingly, some apothecaries got creative. They'd grind up random bones, wrap them in resin, and sell them as the real thing. Which means that if you were a wealthy nobleman sipping your daily dose of mumia, there's a good chance you were just drinking powdered peasant. Now, let's float over to another favorite, Theriac. This was the medieval equivalent of a miracle drug. A thick, sticky paste made from dozens of ingredients, sometimes over 60. Herbs, spices, honey, opium, even bits of viper flesh. Because nothing says trust me. I'm a professional like adding snake meat to your medicine. Theriac was supposed to cure everything. Fevers, stomach problems, plague, you name it. It was so famous that rulers hoarded it. Venice became a major center of production, and the recipe was guarded like state treasure. Apothecaries would hold public ceremonies to prepare it, with witnesses to ensure no one cut corners. Imagine a medieval cooking show, but with more snakes and fewer aprons. And then there were charms. Because sometimes herbs weren't enough. Sometimes you needed a little magic, if you had epilepsy. For example, one suggestion was to wear a piece of coral around your neck. If you had a toothache, you might carry a dead mole in your pocket. And if you had trouble sleeping, you could place a sprig of St. John's wort under your pillow, which, to be fair, is still more appealing than modern sleeping pills with their endless list of side effects. The line between medicine and magic was blurry. Herbalists knew their plants, but they also knew their customers. And if a charm made someone feel better, who was going to argue? Let's drift into the social side of things. Apothecaries weren't just shopkeepers. They were part of the community. People came to them for advice, for gossip, and sometimes just for company. The shop was a gathering place, a spot where you could hear the latest news while picking up your wormwood tonic. But it wasn't all friendly. Apothecaries had rivals. Physicians, for one. University-trained doctors looked down on apothecaries, accusing them of being little more than glorified spice merchants. Apothecaries, in turn, thought physicians were pompous and out of touch. After all, what good was a fancy Latin diagnosis if you couldn't actually provide the medicine? And then there were the wise women. The herbalists who worked outside the system, often in rural areas. They had deep knowledge of plants, passed down through generations. But they also risked being accused of witchcraft. Because if you were a woman who knew how to heal, you were always one bad harvest away from being blamed for it now. Let's take a slow step into the sensory world of the apothecary. The smell would hit you first. A mix of dried lavender, pungent garlic, sharp vinegar, and something faintly rotten that you couldn't quite identify. The shelves were cluttered, the light dim, the air heavy with dust. You might hear the scrape of a pestle against stone, the creak of wooden beams, the murmur of voices as customers described their ailments. It wasn't glamorous, but it was alive. A place where knowledge, tradition, and desperation all came together in little paper packets of powder. And here's the irony. For all the superstition, for all the questionable cures, the apothecary was a step forward. It was an attempt to systematize medicine, to make it accessible. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was better than nothing. And sometimes it even worked. So, as we drift deeper into this hidden world, remember, the medieval apothecary wasn't just about herbs. It was about people. Their hopes, their fears, their willingness to believe in anything that might bring relief. The apothecary's reputation was always a balancing act. On one hand, they were respected. People needed them. They were the ones who could mix up a salve for your aching joints, or a tonic for your indigestion, or a poultice for that suspicious rash you didn't want to show anyone else. On the other hand, they were also viewed with suspicion. Because when you're the person who knows how to heal, you're also the person who knows how to harm. And in a world where gossip spread faster than the plague, that was a dangerous reputation to carry. Some apothecaries leaned into the healer image. They decorated their shops with religious symbols, invoked saints when preparing remedies, and made sure everyone knew they were pious, respectable, and definitely not dabbling in anything shady. Others leaned into the mystery. They cultivated an aura of secret knowledge, whispered recipes, and exotic ingredients. Because let's be honest, if you're trying to sell someone powdered unicorn horn, it helps if you look like you know something they don't. Speaking of unicorn horn, let's pause there. Because yes, that was a thing. Apothecaries sold powdered unicorn horn as a cure for poison. It was, of course, not unicorn horn. It was usually narwhal tusk, imported from the Arctic. But in a world where most people had never seen a narwhal, you could pass it off as magical, and it sold for a fortune. Kings and queens collected it, displayed it, and sometimes even drank it, because nothing says I'm rich and paranoid like sipping ground up tusk to ward off assassins. Now, let's drift into the daily rhythm of the apothecary. Morning would begin with preparation, grinding herbs, mixing powders, boiling syrups. The shop had to be stocked, the jars refilled, the shelves organized, well, as organized as they ever got. Customers would trickle in throughout the day. A farmer with a sick child, a merchant with a stomachache from too much bad wine, a nobleman's servant, sent to discreetly pick up something for his master's embarrassing condition. Each customer brought not just money, but stories. The apothecary became a kind of confessor. People shared their ailments, their fears, their secrets, and the herbalist listened, nodded, and handed over a remedy. Whether it worked or not, the act of being heard was sometimes half the cure. Let's float over to the recipes themselves. Some were simple: a tea of chamomile for sleep, a poultice of comfrey for wounds, a syrup of honey and thyme for coughs. These were practical, effective, and still used today. Others were more creative. For example, to cure baldness, one recipe suggested rubbing the ashes of a burned hedgehog onto your scalp. For epilepsy, you might drink a potion made from the blood of a freshly killed pigeon. And for jaundice, you could wear a yellow gemstone round your neck, because apparently color coordination was considered medicinal. And then there were the love potions, always popular, always questionable. Some were harmless herbs like basil or fennel, believed to inspire affection. Others were downright alarming, like potions made from ground-up beetles, or concoctions that included bodily fluids. Because nothing says romance like slipping your crush a drink laced with questionable ingredients from the back shelf of an apothecary shop. Of course, whether they worked or not is debatable, but people believed, and belief is powerful now. Let's take a slow step back and look at the bigger picture. The medieval apothecary was part of a larger medical system. At the top were the physicians, university-trained, Latin-speaking, expensive. Below them were the surgeons, practical, hands-on, often looked down upon because they actually touched patients. And then there were the apothecaries, somewhere in the middle. Not as prestigious as physicians, but more accessible. Not as rough and ready as surgeons, but more refined than the village healer. It was a hierarchy, but also a network. Physicians wrote prescriptions, apothecaries filled them, surgeons patched up the messes. And through it all, ordinary people navigated their way, hoping someone, somewhere, had the answer to their pain. And here's the quiet truth. For all the strange remedies, for all the powdered gems and unicorn horns, the apothecary shop was a place of hope. People came because they wanted to believe in healing. They wanted to believe that a jar of dried leaves, a vial of syrup, or a charm tucked under the pillow could make things better. And sometimes it did so. Where does that leave us? We've wandered through the cluttered shelves, sniffed the rosemary and garlic, peeked at the jars of questionable powders, and listened to the apothecary mutter about remedies that ranged from sensible to absurd. We've seen how willow bark could ease a headache, how powdered emeralds could empty your purse, and how a narwhal tusk could masquerade as unicorn horn. We've drifted through the daily rhythm of the shop, the gossip, the rivalries with physicians and wise women, and the way these herbalists balanced healing with hustling. We've noticed how the line between medicine and magic was never really clear, and how people clung to hope in the form of dried leaves, sticky syrups, and charms tucked under pillows. And that's the quiet beauty of the medieval apothecary. It wasn't sterile, it wasn't scientific in the way we think of today, and it certainly wasn't consistent. But it was human. It was a place where knowledge, tradition, superstition, and desperation all mingled together in little paper packets. A place where people came not just for cures, but for comfort. So, we left off with the apothecary's shop as a place of hope, gossip, and the occasional questionable love potion. Now, let's float into the world of regulation. Because, believe it or not, medieval authorities eventually decided that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a great idea to let anyone with a mortar and pestle sell whatever they wanted. Guilds began to form. Apothecaries banded together, creating rules, standards, and exams. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, you couldn't just set up shop and start selling powdered hedgehog for boldness. You had to prove you knew your rosemary from your rue. And yes, there were inspections. Officials would drop by, check your scales, sniff your jars, and make sure you weren't cutting your saffron with sawdust. Because nothing ruins a good medieval stew or a good medieval medicine like cheap filler, of course. Regulation didn't stop the creativity. It just made it more official. Recipes were written down, tested, and sometimes even approved by city councils. Imagine your local government today debating whether powdered unicorn horn should be taxed at the same rate as cinnamon. That was the vibe now. Let's wander into the overlap between apothecaries and alchemists. The line between the two was blurry. Both worked with strange ingredients, both loved a good experiment, and both promised results that were sometimes optimistic. The alchemist, of course, was chasing the philosopher's stone, eternal life, and the ability to turn lead into gold. The apothecary was chasing something a little more practical, like a cure for your neighbor's gout, but the tools were the same: mortar, furnaces, glass vessels, and sometimes the people were the same too. An apothecary might dabble in alchemy on the side, or an alchemist might sell a few herbal remedies to pay the bills. Because eternal life is a long project, and rent was still due. Let's float over to the scandals. Because of course there were scandals. Apothecaries were sometimes accused of watering down medicines, overcharging customers, or selling outright fakes. A jar labeled saffron might actually contain marigold petals. A vial of antidote might just be honey and vinegar. And if you were unlucky, your expensive cure might be nothing more than colored water. There were also darker accusations, poisoning, for example. If a nobleman died suddenly after drinking a tonic, suspicion often fell on the apothecary, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. But when your job involves mixing mysterious powders, you're always one step away from being blamed for murder. Now, let's slow down and look at the customers. The wealthy had the best access. They could afford imported spices, exotic resins, and yes, powdered gems. Their remedies were elaborate, expensive, and often more about status than effectiveness. Drinking a potion laced with crushed pearls didn't necessarily cure your cough, but it did show off your bank account. The poor, on the other hand, relied on simpler remedies. Local herbs, common plants, and whatever the apothecary could spare. A tea of mint for stomach aches. A poultice of garlic for wounds. It wasn't glamorous, but it was accessible. And sometimes, it worked just as well as the fancy stuff. Let's drift into the emotional side, because medicine wasn't just about the body. It was about the mind. The act of visiting the apothecary, describing your symptoms, and receiving a remedy, any remedy, was comforting. It gave people a sense of control in a world where illness was constant and explanations were scarce. And that's something we can still recognize today. The placebo effect, the power of belief, the comfort of ritual. Whether it was a charm against nightmares or a syrup for coughs, the apothecary's medicine often worked because people believed it would. And finally, let's step back and see the apothecary as part of a long tradition. They weren't inventing medicine from scratch. They were building on ancient knowledge, Greek, Roman, Arabic, and beyond. Texts like Dioscorides, De Materia Medica were copied, studied, and used as references for centuries. The apothecary was part of a chain, passing down knowledge, adapting it, and adding their own local twists. So when you picture that little shop, don't just see jars of herbs. See centuries of accumulated wisdom, filtered through superstition, shaped by culture, and handed down from one generation to the next. One of the most curious things about medieval apothecaries is how much they loved animal parts. Plants were the backbone of the trade, sure, but animals crept in everywhere. Powdered antlers were thought to strengthen the body. Dried lizards were slipped into concoctions for fevers. Bear fat was rubbed on aching joints. And if you were really unlucky, you might be prescribed a poultice made from earthworms. Yes, mashed worms. Because apparently, nothing says healing like smearing garden creatures on your skin. And then there was ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the intestines of sperm whales. It washed up on beaches, and apothecaries snapped it up. It was used in perfumes, but also in medicine, believed to cure headaches, colds, and even heart problems. Imagine walking into a shop and being told, yes, this lump of whale intestine wax will fix you right up. And people bought it. Because when you're desperate, you'll try anything. Let's float over to bizarre recipes. One medieval remedy for epilepsy involved drinking the blood of a freshly killed gladiator, which is both impractical and disturbing, considering gladiators weren't exactly common in medieval Europe. But the idea lingered, passed down from Roman texts. Another cure for nosebleeds suggested stuffing a frog into your mouth until the bleeding stopped, which, if nothing else, would certainly distract you from the nosebleed. And for toothaches, you could burn a dog's tooth, grind it into powder, and rub it on your gums. Because apparently, the logic was, fight tooth with tooth, now. Let's drift into the superstitions that clung to the apothecary's trade. Herbs weren't just plants. They had personalities, powers, and cosmic alignments. Some were ruled by the sun, others by the moon. Some were hot, some cold, some dry, some wet. The theory of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile guided everything. If you had too much phlegm, you needed warming herbs. Too much black bile, you needed something cooling. It was less about science and more about balancing an invisible recipe inside your body. And then there were astrological charts. Yes, your medicine might depend on the position of the stars. If Mars was in the wrong house, maybe it wasn't the right time to take that laxative. Because nothing says personalized healthcare like consulting your horoscope before drinking wormwood tea. Let's pause and look at the apothecary's role in society again. They weren't just healers. They were also merchants, middlemen, and sometimes even smugglers. Exotic spices and herbs came from faraway lands: cinnamon from Sri Lanka, pepper from India, frankincense from Arabia. These were expensive, rare, and highly sought after. And apothecaries were right in the middle of that trade, which meant they weren't just mixing remedies. They were also part of global commerce, connected to trade routes that stretched across continents. Your little jar of cinnamon powder wasn't just a spice. It was a piece of a vast, complicated network of ships, caravans, and markets. And here's the irony. For all the exotic imports, some of the most effective remedies were the simplest local herbs. Willow bark for pain, mint for digestion, garlic for infections, plants that grew in fields and gardens right outside the door. But of course, those didn't impress wealthy customers nearly as much as powdered sapphire. Now, let's drift into the emotional atmosphere again. Imagine being sick in the Middle Ages. No antibiotics, no vaccines, no real understanding of germs. Illness was frightening, mysterious, and often deadly. The apothecary's shop was a small island of possibility, a place where you could at least try something, where you could walk away with a jar, a packet, or a charm, and feel like you weren't completely helpless. That feeling mattered. It gave people hope, and hope, in its own way, was medicine. The apothecary's apprentices deserve a moment here, because someone had to do the grinding, the sweeping, and the endless fetching of herbs. Apprenticeship could last years. You'd start young, maybe 12 or 13, and spend your days pounding roots into powder until your arms ached. You'd learn how to identify plants, how to measure carefully, and, most importantly, how not to poison anyone by accident. It wasn't glamorous, but if you stuck with it, you could eventually open your own shop. And yes, mistakes happened. Mix up your jars, and suddenly someone's cough syrup became a laxative. Or worse. Which is why guilds and masters drilled apprentices constantly. Accuracy wasn't just a matter of pride, it was survival. Let's float over to the relationship between apothecaries and religion. Church authorities kept a close eye on medicine. Healing was seen as part of God's work, but it was also suspicious if it strayed too close to magic. Many apothecaries decorated their shops with crosses or images of saints, partly out of devotion, partly as insurance. If someone accused you of witchcraft, it helped to point at the crucifix above your counter and say, "See? Totally holy." Monasteries, too, were centers of herbal knowledge. Monks cultivated gardens filled with medicinal plants, sage, mint, fennel, rue. Their manuscripts preserved recipes and remedies, which apothecaries often borrowed. So, in a way, the apothecary's shelves were an extension of the monastery's garden, filtered through commerce and necessity. Now, let's wander into the seasonal rhythms of the trade. Spring was for gathering fresh herbs. Summer was for drying and storing them. Autumn was for preparing syrups and tonics to last through the winter. And winter was when business boomed. Colds, fevers, coughs, and the general misery of damp stone houses kept customers coming through the door. The apothecary's shop was warm, filled with the smell of spices, and, if you were lucky, stocked with remedies that made the season a little more bearable. And then there's the economics of it all. Some herbs were cheap and common. Nettles, dandelions, garlic, these grew everywhere. Others were luxuries. Saffron, for example, was worth its weight in gold. Literally, a tiny vial could cost a fortune. And apothecaries guarded their saffron like treasure. There were even laws against adulterating it, because people kept trying to stretch their supply with cheaper substitutes. So when you bought saffron from an apothecary, you weren't just buying a spice. You were buying status. You were saying, yes, I can afford this golden thread of luxury, and I'm going to sprinkle it on my stew or my medicine, just because I can. Let's drift into the sounds of the shop, the scrape of pestles grinding roots, the crackle of a small fire under a pot of syrup, the rustle of paper as herbs were wrapped into little packets, the murmur of voices, customers describing their ailments, the apothecary offering advice, apprentices whispering as they tried not to spill anything. It was a quiet, steady rhythm, not dramatic, not exciting, just the hum of daily life, punctuated by the occasional sneeze when someone opened a jar of pepper. And here's a thought: the apothecary's shop was also a place of stories. Every jar had a tale. This resin came from Arabia, carried by caravan across deserts. That spice came by ship from India, through storms and pirates. This herb was gathered at dawn, under a full moon, because that's when its powers were strongest. Whether true or not, the stories added weight to the remedies. They made the medicine feel larger than life, connected to a world beyond the village or the city. The witchcraft connection was always lurking in the background. Herbalists, especially women, walked a fine line. If you healed someone with sage tea, you were a wise helper. If you healed someone with sage tea and they later had a bad harvest, suddenly you were a witch. The same rosemary sprig that blessed a household could, in the wrong gossip, become evidence of sorcery. Apothecaries tried to protect themselves with legitimacy. Guild membership, licenses, religious symbols. But the village healer, the midwife, the woman who knew which plants eased childbirth or soothed fevers, she didn't always have that shield. And so, herbal knowledge became both power and risk. It's worth noting that many of the so-called witches accused in trials were simply women with deep botanical knowledge. They knew which roots calmed pain, which leaves reduced swelling, which flowers could bring on a miscarriage. In a world where medicine was scarce, that knowledge was invaluable. But it was also threatening, and so the line blurred, healer or heretic, depending on who was asking. Let's float into the gender divide. Male apothecaries were more likely to be accepted as professionals, especially in cities. They had guilds, apprenticeships, and official recognition. Women, on the other hand, often practiced informally in kitchens and gardens. Their remedies were passed down through families, not written in Latin texts. And while their cures were often just as effective, they carried the stigma of being unofficial. This divide shaped the way knowledge was preserved. Male apothecaries wrote recipes into books, codified them, and passed them through institutions. Women's knowledge was oral, practical, lived, which means much of it was lost, erased, or only remembered when it was dragged into court as evidence of witchcraft. Now, let's drift back to the apothecary shelves, because they tell their own story. Some jars held familiar plants, mint thyme, lavender. Others held things that sound more like ingredients for a spell than a medicine. Powdered toad, dried bat, snakeskin. Were these really used? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes they were symbolic, included in recipes because tradition said so, not because they did anything, but they added to the aura of mystery. And then there were the imports. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, spices that traveled thousands of miles. They weren't just flavorings. They were medicines, preservatives, even charms. A pinch of nutmeg could be prescribed for stomach problems. A clove might be chewed for toothache. And the fact that they came from distant lands only added to their prestige. Let's pause on cloves, because they're a perfect example. In medieval Europe, cloves were rare and expensive. They came from the Spice Islands, thousands of miles away. To get them, merchants had to cross oceans, deserts, and rival empires. By the time they reached an apothecary's shelf, they were worth a small fortune. And yet, people chewed them for toothaches, brewed them into tonics, and even carried them as charms against plague. So when you picture a medieval apothecary, don't just see a dusty shop. See a global network stretching from Indonesian islands to European cities, all converging in a little jar of cloves. Now, let's drift into the politics of medicine. Apothecaries weren't just neutral healers. They were part of city life, part of power structures. Rulers relied on them for remedies, and sometimes for poisons. Councils regulated them, taxed them, and occasionally punished them. And in times of plague, they were both essential and suspect. If people lived, the apothecary was praised. If people died, the apothecary was blamed. It was a precarious position. Too successful, and you attracted envy. Too many failures, and you attracted suspicion. And yet, the trade endured, because people always needed medicine. No matter how questionable, and here's the quiet irony. The apothecary's world was both deeply local and profoundly global. Local herbs gathered from fields. Global spices carried across continents. Local gossip shaping reputations. Global trade shaping prices. It was a world balance between the familiar and the exotic, the practical and the mystical. When plague swept through towns, the apothecary's shop became both a sanctuary and a symbol of desperation. People crowded in, begging for remedies, vinegar tonics, posies of herbs, charms to hang round the neck. None of it could truly stop the Black Death, of course, but the act of trying mattered. A sprig of rosemary tucked into a mask, a vial of vinegar carried in the pocket. It gave people something to hold on to when the world felt like it was unraveling. And that's the thread, running through everything we've seen in this part. The apothecary's world was never just about plants and powders. It was about belief. Belief that a jar of cloves could protect you. Belief that a charm could ward off nightmares. Belief that the man or woman behind the counter had access to knowledge that might tip the scales between sickness and survival. The apothecary stood at the crossroads of medicine, magic, commerce, and community. Sometimes trusted, sometimes feared, always necessary. Their shelves held not just herbs, but stories. Their jars contained not just powders, but centuries of tradition, trade, and hope. The apothecary as a person was often a curious mix. Part scientist, part merchant, part gossip, part mystic. They weren't cloistered scholars like physicians, and they weren't rough and ready like surgeons. They lived in the middle ground, in the marketplace, with one foot in the world of trade and the other in the world of healing. Some became well known in their communities. Their reputations could make or break them. A skilled apothecary might be called to serve a noble household, supplying remedies for everything from indigestion to melancholy. A less skilled one might be remembered only for the time his miracle tonic gave half the town diarrhea. Let's float into a few famous names. One of the most notable was Nicholas Culpeper, a 17th century English herbalist and apothecary. He came a little later than the medieval period, but he's worth mentioning because he embodied the rebellious spirit of the trade. Culpeper translated Latin medical texts into English, making knowledge accessible to ordinary people. Physicians hated him for it. He also leaned heavily on astrology, insisting that herbs had planetary rulers and that treatments should be timed with the stars. Imagine your pharmacist today saying, "Yes, this cough syrup will work best if you take it when Venus is in Taurus." That was Culpeper's vibe. Earlier, in the medieval Islamic world, figures like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Al-Razi wrote massive medical texts that influenced European apothecaries for centuries. Their works described hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products, blending observation with theory. European apothecaries copied, translated, and adapted these texts, often without fully understanding them, but grateful for the recipes. Now, let's drift into the blurred line between apothecary and early pharmacist. By the late Middle Ages, apothecaries were starting to look more like what we'd recognize today. They had official shops, licenses, and recipes written down in They were expected to follow standards, to measure carefully, and to avoid outright fraud. Slowly, the trade was professionalizing, but the old habits lingered. Astrology still guided prescriptions. Charms still hung in shops. And powdered gems still found their way into remedies for the wealthy. It was a strange hybrid world, half science, half superstition, all wrapped up in the smell of dried herbs. Let's pause on the personal lives of apothecaries. They weren't rich, usually. They lived modestly, supported by steady trade. Their apprentices often lived in the same house, sleeping in cramped quarters above the shop. Families were involved too. Wives and children helped gather herbs, prepare remedies, and serve customers. The apothecary's shop was both workplace and home, filled with the constant hum of grinding, boiling, and measuring. And yes, there were rivalries. Apothecaries competed for customers, accused each other of cutting corners, and sometimes even spied on one another's recipes. Because when your livelihood depends on who has the best wormwood tonic, you guard your secrets carefully. Now, let's drift into the transition toward modernity by the Renaissance. Apothecaries were increasingly tied to universities, hospitals, and official institutions. Their recipes were standardized, their shops inspected, their role more clearly defined. The mystical side began to fade, slowly, unevenly, but steadily. What remained was the foundation of pharmacy, the careful preparation and dispensing of medicines. But even as the trade professionalized, the old image lingered. The jars of herbs, the bundles of dried plants, the whispered advice across the counter. The apothecary remained a figure of both science and story, bridging the gap between the medieval world of charms and the modern world of chemistry. The royal connection is worth lingering on. Apothecaries weren't just for townsfolk and merchants. Kings and queens had their own personal apothecaries, often kept on retainer. These men, and occasionally women, prepared remedies for everything from indigestion after a royal feast to the mysterious melancholy that seemed to afflict half the nobility. Being a royal apothecary was both an honor and a hazard. On one hand, you had steady income, prestige, and access to exotic ingredients. On the other hand, if your remedies didn't work, or worse, if the monarch died under your care, you could find yourself accused of incompetence or even treason. Imagine being blamed for a king's stomachache because your syrup of figs didn't quite do the trick. Let's float into the prestige of exotic remedies. Royal apothecaries were expected to provide the best, which meant importing the rarest powdered pearls for digestion, gold leaf dissolved in wine for vitality, unicorn horn narwhal tusk, really as an antidote to poison. These weren't just medicines, they were status symbols. To sip a tonic laced with crushed gems was to remind everyone that you were wealthy enough to literally drink your fortune. And of course, the apothecary profited from this. The rarer the ingredient, the higher the price, which meant that sometimes the apothecary's skill wasn't just in mixing herbs, but in convincing a noble that what they were drinking was worth the cost. Now, let's drift back to the ordinary apothecary's life. Not everyone served kings. Most apothecaries lived in towns, serving neighbors and travelers. Their days were long, their work repetitive, and their profits modest. They weren't rich, but they weren't destitute either. They occupied a middle ground, respected but not exalted, and yet their shops were hubs of community life. People came not just for remedies, but for conversation. The apothecary heard confessions, complaints, and gossip. Who was sick? Who was feuding? Who was secretly buying a love potion? In a way, the apothecary was as much a keeper of secrets as a seller of herbs. Let's pause on the love potions again, because they never really went away. Even in royal courts, people wanted them. Nobles might discreetly request a charm or a potion to win affection, or to rekindle a fading marriage. The apothecary obliged, mixing herbs like basil, fennel, or even mandrake root. Did they work? Probably not. But the belief was powerful, and sometimes that was enough. And if the potion didn't work, well, the apothecary could always blame the stars. Ah yes, Venus was in the wrong house. Try again next month. Now, let's drift into the slow evolution toward science. By the late medieval period, apothecaries were beginning to rely more on observation and less on superstition. They noticed which remedies actually worked. They recorded results. They refined recipes. Slowly, the balance shifted. Astrology and charms didn't disappear, but they became less central. The groundwork for modern pharmacy was being laid, one jar of willow bark at a time, and yet the image of the apothecary remained steeped in mystery. Even as their trade professionalized, they were still seen as keepers of secret knowledge. Their shops still smelled of herbs and resins. Their shelves still held jars with strange labels. Their remedies still carried a touch of the magical dot. The legacy of the apothecary is everywhere once you start looking. The modern pharmacy, with its neat rows of bottles and its white-coated staff, is really just a polished descendant of that cluttered medieval shop. The mortar and pestle, still a symbol of pharmacy today, comes straight from the apothecary's bench. The idea of weighing, measuring, and dispensing carefully prepared remedies, same roots, just with fewer dried frogs and more barcodes. Even the language lingers. The word drugstore may sound modern, but drugs in the medieval sense simply meant dried plants. Apothecaries were literally drug merchants, and the word pharmacist itself comes from the Greek pharmakon, meaning both remedy and poison, which feels fitting, given how often medieval remedies straddled that line. Let's float into the continuity of remedies. Some of the herbs that lined medieval shelves are still in use today. Willow bark became aspirin. Foxglove became digitalis, a heart medicine. Poppy gave us morphine. Mint, chamomile, lavender, still staples in teas and oils. The apothecary may not have understood the chemistry, but they knew the effects. Trial and error, observation, and tradition carried that knowledge forward until science could explain it. And then there are the remedies that didn't survive. Powdered emeralds, unicorn horn, frog poultices. These faded away, remembered more as curiosities than cures. But they remind us how medicine is always a mix of what works, what people believe, and what people can afford. Now, let's drift into the symbolic role. The apothecary wasn't just a shopkeeper. They were a symbol of possibility. In a world where illness was constant and explanations were scarce, they represented the hope that something could be done. That a jar, a syrup, a charm might tip the balance. That hope mattered as much as the herbs themselves. And that's why the apothecary's image lingers in our imagination. The dim shop, the shelves of jars, the bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters. It feels timeless. A place where knowledge and mystery meet, where healing and superstition blur, where the human need for comfort finds expression in powders and potions. The apothecary's world was never simple. It was a patchwork of jars and powders, of whispered recipes and carefully measured doses of hope and suspicion. They lived in the middle ground, between physicians and surgeons, between magic and science, between the local gossip of the marketplace and the global trade routes that brought cinnamon and cloves to their shelves. Their legacy is still with us. Every time you walk into a pharmacy, see a mortar and pestle symbol, or sip a cup of chamomile tea for sleep, you're brushing against the same traditions that filled those medieval shops. The difference is that today, the shelves are brighter, the labels clearer, and the remedies tested in laboratories instead of under the stars. But the human need, the desire for comfort, for healing, for something to believe in, remains unchanged. We've already wandered through jars, powders, apprenticeships, royal connections, and a slow shift toward pharmacy. Now, let's drift into the stranger remedies that never quite worked. The role of apothecaries in royal courts in more detail, and how their legacy shaped the way medicine and superstition continued to intertwine. The stranger remedies are always the most fun to linger on, because they show just how creative or desperate people could be. For example, one medieval cure for plague involved drinking a potion made from crushed emeralds. Yes, actual emeralds. Because if you're going to die anyway, why not go out with a little sparkle in your stomach? Another suggestion was to carry a live chicken under your arm, because apparently the bird would draw out the disease, which, if nothing else, gave you something to cuddle while you waited for the inevitable. For headaches, Some recipes recommended tying a dead mole to your head. For nosebleeds, stuffing a frog into your mouth. And for epilepsy, drinking the blood of a freshly killed animal. These weren't fringe ideas. They were written down, copied, and passed along as serious medical advice. And yet, alongside these bizarre concoctions, there were remedies that actually worked. Willow bark for pain, garlic for infections, honey for wounds. The apothecary shelves were a mix of nonsense and genuine medicine. And the trick was knowing which was which. Now, let's float back into the royal courts. Because apothecaries there had a very particular role. Royal apothecaries weren't just mixing herbs, they were managing prestige. Their remedies had to look impressive, taste exotic, and sound expensive. A syrup of figs might work just fine for constipation, but it didn't have the same flair as a tonic laced with powdered pearls. So pearls it was. Kings and queens also demanded antidotes for poison. The fear of being poisoned was constant in royal courts, and apothecaries were expected to provide protection. Theriac, that sticky paste of dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh, was a favorite. Monarchs hoarded it, displayed it, and sometimes even staged public ceremonies where it was prepared just to show off. And of course, if a monarch died suddenly, suspicion often fell on the apothecary, which made the job both prestigious and perilous. One wrong potion, and you could go from royal servant to royal scapegoat overnight. Let's drift into the symbolism of remedies. Many of the stranger ingredients weren't chosen because they worked, but because they carried meaning. Gems were pure, so they must purify the body. Gold was incorruptible, so it must protect against corruption. Unicorn horn was mythical, so it must ward off the most dangerous threats. Medicine wasn't just about chemistry, it was about symbolism, ritual, and belief. And that's why people paid fortunes for remedies that probably did nothing, because the act of taking them felt powerful. It felt like protection. And in a world where illness was mysterious and terrifying, that feeling mattered now. Let's step back and look at the legacy of superstition in medicine. Even as apothecaries professionalized, superstition never really disappeared. Astrology lingered. Charms lingered. The idea that certain plants had magical properties lingered. And honestly, some of it still lingers today. Herbal teas, essential oils, crystals. Modern echoes of the same desire to find healing in nature, in symbols, in rituals. The difference is that now, science runs alongside it. We know why willow bark works. We know why garlic fights infection. But the human need for ritual, for meaning, for a little magic in our medicine, that hasn't gone away. When the plague struck, apothecaries were suddenly at the center of everything. People poured into their shops, desperate for anything that might help. Remedies ranged from the practical, vinegar washes, posies of herbs, to the bizarre, like carrying a dried toad in your pocket. Some apothecaries sold plague water, a concoction of herbs steeped in wine or vinegar, meant to purify the body. Did it work? Not really, but it gave people something to cling to. The apothecary shelves became a battlefield of hope. Jars of rosemary, sage, and rue were sold as protection. Spices like cinnamon and cloves were burned to cleanse the air. And theriac, that sticky paste of dozens of ingredients, was touted as the ultimate safeguard. It was expensive, exotic, and almost certainly useless against plague. But people bought it anyway. Let's float into the psychology of remedies. In times of crisis, the act of doing something, anything, was powerful. Carrying a charm, drinking a tonic, burning herbs. These rituals gave people a sense of control in a world that felt uncontrollable. The apothecary wasn't just selling medicine, they were selling reassurance. And sometimes that reassurance was as important as the herbs themselves. Now, let's wander into the intersection of medicine and magic. Apothecaries often worked alongside astrologers. Charts were consulted to determine the best time to take a remedy. If Mars was in the wrong house, maybe you waited a day before drinking your tonic. Herbs were linked to planets, sage to Jupiter, rosemary to the sun, rue to Mars. The logic was symbolic, not scientific, but it gave structure to the chaos of illness. And then there were charms. Written words worn around the neck. Sprigs of herbs hung above doors. Stones carried in pockets. The apothecary might not have believed in them, but they stocked them because customers wanted them. And in a way, that was part of the medicine too. Let's pause on the economics of plague remedies. Prices skyrocketed. Spices, herbs, and charms became luxuries. Some apothecaries grew rich, selling remedies to the desperate. Others were accused of profiteering, of exploiting fear. And when remedies failed, as they inevitably did, anger sometimes turned on the apothecary. They were praised as saviors one day, blamed as frauds the next. It was a precarious balance. Too much success, and you looked suspicious. Too little, and you looked incompetent. The apothecary walked a narrow path, trying to survive alongside their customers. And here's the quiet truth. The apothecary's world was never just about herbs. It was about belief, ritual, and survival. The jars on the shelves held more than powders. They held stories, symbols, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something could help. The truth is, superstition never really left the apothecary's shelves. Even as universities codified medicine, even as guilds enforced standards, people still wanted charms. They still wanted their remedies timed with the stars. They still wanted a sprig of rosemary tucked under the pillow, or a gemstone worn against the skin. And apothecaries obliged. Because medicine was never just about the body, it was about the mind, the spirit, and the comfort of ritual. A tonic might ease your stomach, but a charm eased your fear. And fear was often the greatest sickness. Let's float into the transition years by the Renaissance. Apothecaries were increasingly tied to hospitals, universities, and official institutions. Their recipes were written down in formularies, their shops inspected, their role more clearly defined. But the old ways lingered. Astrology charts still hung behind counters. Bundles of herbs still dangled from rafters. A jar of thuriac might sit beside a jar of chamomile, both sold with equal confidence. It was a world in transition, half rooted in tradition, half reaching toward science. And the apothecary stood right in the middle, balancing jars of rosemary with jars of powdered pearls, balancing the expectations of customers with the scrutiny of authorities. Now, let's pause on the cultural memory. Even centuries later, the apothecary's image remains powerful. In literature, in folklore, in our imagination, the apothecary is always there. The dim shop, the mysterious jars, the whispered remedies. Shakespeare gave us the apothecary in Romeo and Juliet, selling poison in a darkened shop. Fairy tales gave us witches with cupboards of herbs and potions. And modern fantasy still leans on that image, the healer with bundles of dried plants, the potion maker with shelves of jars. It's a memory that lingers because it speaks to something universal, the human desire for healing, for mystery, for the idea that somewhere, in a jar or a charm, there might be an answer. The long shadow of superstition was hard to shake. Even as universities grew more powerful and physicians gained prestige, ordinary people still trusted the rituals. A charm tucked under the pillow, a sprig of rue pinned to a cloak, a vial of plague water carried in the pocket. These weren't just medical acts, they were cultural habits. They gave people a sense of safety, even when the science was shaky. Apothecaries knew this. They stocked the charms, they sold the herbs, they nodded gravely when asked about the stars. It wasn't always about belief, it was about business. If customers wanted a potion timed to the moon, you gave them one. If they wanted a gemstone ground into powder, you obliged. Because in the end, the apothecary's role was to provide comfort. However it was packaged, let's float into the slow fading of the old ways. By the 17th century, chemistry was beginning to take root. Laboratories replaced backroom furnaces. Observation and experiment began to matter more than tradition and astrology. Apothecaries didn't vanish, they adapted. They became pharmacists, chemists, dispensers of standardized medicines. The jars of dried frogs and powdered gems slowly disappeared, replaced by bottles of tinctures and measured doses. But the memory lingered. The image of the apothecary shop, dim, cluttered, mysterious, stayed in the cultural imagination. Even as medicine modernized, people still pictured the healer with bundles of herbs, the jars of powders, the whispered remedies. And here's the irony. Even today, echoes of that world remain. Herbal teas, essential oils, crystals, home remedies, they're all modern versions of the same desire. The belief that nature, ritual, and a little mystery can heal us. Science has advanced, but the human need for comfort hasn't changed. By the end of the Middle Ages, the apothecary's world was already shifting. The jars of dried frogs and powdered gems were still there, but alongside them came more careful records, more standardized recipes, and a growing sense that medicine could be studied, tested, and improved. The mystical never vanished. It lingered in charms, in rituals, in the comfort of rosemary sprigs and protective amulets. But the seeds of modern pharmacy had been planted. The apothecary remained a figure of paradox, a healer and a merchant, a scientist and a storyteller, a trusted neighbor and a potential suspect. Their shelves held both nonsense and knowledge, both superstition and science. And yet, through it all, they offered something essential, the possibility of healing, or at least the feeling of it. The farmer was perhaps the most common visitor. Life in the fields was hard, and injuries were constant. A cut from a sickle, a twisted ankle, a cough from damp nights in the barn. The farmer would shuffle into the apothecary's shop, smelling faintly of earth and hay, and ask for something simple, a salve for wounds, a tonic for fever, a poultice for aching joints. The remedies were often local herbs, garlic, nettle, comfrey, cheap, practical, and familiar. The farmer didn't need powdered emeralds. He needed something that worked well enough to get him back into the fields by morning. The merchant, on the other hand, had different concerns. Long journeys, heavy meals, and the stress of trade brought stomach problems, headaches, and the occasional bout of gout. Merchants had more money than farmers, so they could afford exotic remedies. Cinnamon for digestion, cloves for toothache, saffron for vitality. They liked remedies that showed off their wealth. Because what's the point of being a successful merchant if you can't sip a tonic laced with imported spices while complaining about tariffs? The noble was a different story altogether. Nobles expected remedies that were as much about prestige as healing. They wanted powdered pearls, gold leaf, and unicorn horn. They wanted their apothecary to provide not just medicine, but spectacle. A noble woman with melancholy might be given a syrup of rose petals and sugar, imported at great expense. A nobleman with indigestion after a feast might be prescribed a tonic of saffron and wine. Whether it worked or not was almost beside the point. The important thing was that it looked impressive, tasted exotic, and cost enough to remind everyone of their status. And then there were the children. Childhood in the Middle Ages was precarious. Illnesses that we shrugged off today could be deadly. Mothers would bring their children to the apothecary for fevers, coughs, or mysterious rashes. Remedies were often gentle: honey syrups, chamomile teas, lavender baths. But sometimes they were harsher, involving purges or bloodletting, because the theory of humors didn't spare the young. The apothecary's shop was a place of both comfort and fear for children. Sweet syrups on one shelf, bitter tonics on another. Let's drift into the emotional side of visiting the apothecary. For many, stepping into the shop was as much about reassurance as medicine. The smell of herbs, the sight of jars, the calm voice of the apothecary, it all created a sense of order in a chaotic world. Even if the remedy didn't work, the act of receiving it mattered. It gave people the feeling that something was being done, that they weren't helpless, and that's why people kept coming back. Not because every remedy cured them, but because the apothecary offered hope. And hope, in a world of sickness and uncertainty, was worth the price of a packet of herbs now. Let's float into the rituals of taking medicine. It wasn't just about swallowing a tonic. It was about the ritual, drinking a syrup at dawn under a certain star, wearing a charm around the neck, burning herbs in the home. These rituals gave structure to illness, turning it into something that could be managed step by step. The apothecary provided the tools, but the patient provided the belief. Together, they created a kind of partnership, half practical, half symbolic. The ritual of the visiting the apothecary wasn't just a transaction. It was an event. People often came in groups, family members, neighbors, or friends, seeking remedies together. A mother might bring her child. A farmer might come with his wife. A noble might send a servant with a carefully written list. The shop was a place of waiting, of listening, of watching others describe their ailments. In that sense, it was a communal space where illness was shared and remedies became part of the collective rhythm of life. The emotional landscape: hope. Patients entered with the hope that something, anything, could ease their suffering. Fear. They also carried fear, especially in times of plague or famine, when remedies felt like fragile shields against overwhelming forces. Trust, the apothecary's calm manner, the careful measuring of powders, the wrapping of herbs into neat packets, all of it built trust, skepticism, and yet there was always a whisper of doubt. Did this tonic really work? Was the apothecary honest? Or was he just selling stories in jars? The language of symptoms patients didn't describe illness the way we do today. They spoke in terms of humors, of heat and cold, of dryness and wetness. A farmer might say, "My body is too cold and damp," meaning he had chills and fatigue. A noble woman might complain of melancholy, which could mean sadness, indigestion, or simply boredom. The apothecary translated these words into remedies, matching symptoms to herbs, balancing humors with powders and syrups. The act of taking medicine for patients The medicine itself was only part of the cure. The ritual mattered, drinking a syrup at dawn, before the cock crowed, wearing a charm until the next full moon, burning herbs in the home to cleanse the air, reciting a prayer as the tonic was swallowed. These rituals gave illness a rhythm, a sense of order. They turned suffering into something that could be managed. Step by step, the social divide, the poor relied on simple herbs, often gathered themselves, but still turned to the apothecary for advice. The middle class, merchants, artisans, sought both practicality and prestige, buying remedies that were effective but also showed off their means. The wealthy demanded spectacle, pearls, gold, exotic spices. For them, medicine was as much about status as healing, and yet, all of them, farmer, merchant, noble, stood in the same shop, breathing the same air, waiting for the same man or woman to hand them a packet of hope. Stories that traveled beyond the shop. Every remedy became part of a family's lore. A farmer might swear that comfrey poultices saved his leg after a nasty cut. A mother might tell her children that honey syrup chased away the fever when nothing else worked. Noble might boast at a feast that his pearl tonic restored his strength. These stories spread through villages, markets, and courts, shaping reputations. An apothecary's success wasn't just measured in coin, but in the tales people told about them. The weight of reputation. One good cure could make an apothecary's name. One failure could haunt them for years. Patients remembered, and they passed those memories on. In this way, the apothecary's influence stretched far beyond the walls of the shop. They lived in the stories whispered at hearths, in the advice passed from neighbor to neighbor, in the quiet faith that their jars held something more than herbs. Spring, the gathering begins. Spring was the season of renewal, and for the apothecary, it meant gathering fresh herbs. Young shoots of nettle, dandelion, and mint were collected for teas and tonics. Flowers like violets and primroses were picked at dawn, when their oils were thought to be strongest. Apprentices often trudged into fields and woods with baskets, learning to identify plants by sight, smell, and touch. A mistake could be costly. Confusing a healing herb with a poisonous one was all too easy. Summer, drying and storing summer, was the busiest season. Herbs were hung in bundles from rafters, drying in the warm air. Roots were dug up, cleaned, and sliced into thin strips to be preserved. Syrups and cordials were brewed, using honey or sugar to preserve the healing properties of plants. The shop itself would be filled with the smell of drying herbs, lavender, sage, rosemary, turning the apothecary's home into a fragrant storeroom. Autumn, preparing for the cold autumn, was the time to prepare remedies for the long winter ahead. Tonics for coughs, syrups for fevers, and ointments for aching joints were made in bulk. Exotic imports, spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg arrived by ship, just in time to be sold as warming remedies. Apothecaries also stocked up on vinegar and wine, used as bases for tinctures and plague waters. Winter, the season of sickness. Winter was when business boomed. Cold, damp houses bred coughs, fevers, and chills. Customers crowded into the apothecary's shop, seeking relief from endless colds and the fear of worse illnesses. Remedies like mulled wine with spices, honey, syrups, and warming poultices were in high demand. The apothecary's shop became a place of comfort in the bleak season. A warm room filled with the smell of herbs, a flickering candle, and the promise of relief. The rhythm of the year, the apothecary's work, was tied to the land and the seasons. Knowledge of when to gather, when to dry, when to brew, and when to sell was as important as the recipes themselves. Medicine wasn't just science, it was agriculture, trade, and timing. And so, the apothecary's year was a cycle. Gather, preserve, prepare, dispense. A rhythm as steady as the turning of the seasons, as familiar as the changing of the stars. Let's let part 6 stretch out further, like the steady turning of the seasons themselves. We've already walked through spring gathering, summer drying, autumn preparations, and winter remedies. Now let's expand part 6 by looking at the rituals, timing, and symbolism that shaped the apothecary's year. The ritual of timing herbs weren't just gathered whenever convenient. Tradition said they had to be picked at certain times of day, or even under certain phases of the moon. St. John's wort, for example, was often harvested on Midsummer's Eve, believed to be at its most potent when the sun was at its peak. Roots were best dug at dawn, when the earth was cool and the plant spirit was still resting. These rituals weren't just superstition. They gave structure to the work, turning the apothecary's year into a calendar of sacred tasks. Festivals and feasts. The apothecary's cycle was also tied to the church calendar. Certain feast days were linked to herbs. Rosemary at Christmas, rue at Easter, herbs blessed on the feast of the Assumption. These moments blurred the line between medicine and religion, reminding patients that healing was as much spiritual as physical. Preservation as an art, drying herbs was only the beginning. Apothecaries also preserved plants and honey. Vinegar or wine. Honey was especially prized. It kept herbs from spoiling, added sweetness, and was itself considered medicinal. Vinegar extracts were thought to cut through illness, while wine carried the warming properties of the sun. These methods meant that the apothecary's shelves were never bare. Even in the depths of winter, the rhythm of trade, the apothecary's year wasn't just about local plants. It was also about waiting for shipments. Spices from the east often arrived in late summer or autumn, carried by caravans and ships. Apothecaries timed their stockpiling to these rhythms, knowing that a jar of cinnamon or saffron could make the difference between a modest winter and a profitable one. The symbolism of the season spring represented renewal. Fresh herbs, new beginnings, the hope of health. Summer was abundance. Shelves filled, jars brimming, the apothecary at their busiest. Autumn was preparation, storing, preserving, bracing for the cold. Winter was endurance, illness everywhere, remedies flowing. The apothecary's role most visible, the cycle repeated year after year. A steady rhythm that tied medicine to the turning of the earth. The apothecary's year as a circle. The apothecary's life was not a straight line, but a cycle. Each season brought its own tasks, its own smells, its own sounds. Spring's baskets of fresh herbs. Summer's rafters heavy with drying bundles. Autumn's bubbling syrups and jars of spice. Winter's crowded shop, filled with coughing customers and the warm glow of candles. The atmosphere of the seasons in spring. The shop smelled green and sharp, filled with the freshness of new leaves. In summer, it was heady and fragrant, the air thick with lavender, sage, and rosemary. In autumn, it was rich and spiced, cinnamon and cloves mingling with vinegar and honey. In winter, it was smoky and warm, the scent of mold remedies and burning herbs wrapping around visitors like a cloak. The apothecary's shop was not static. It changed with the year. a living reflection of the land and the turning of time. We've followed the seasons, the patience, the remedies, and the rhythms of life. Now we'll wander into the tools of the trade, the objects that filled the apothecary's shop, each one essential to the quiet alchemy of healing. Scales and weights precision mattered. Even in a world of superstition, apothecaries used delicate brass or iron scales to measure powders and herbs. Small standardized weights, often shaped like nesting cups or little cubes, ensured that a dram of cinnamon or a scruple of saffron was the same in every shop. Customers watched closely, because a dishonest measure could mean both wasted money and ineffective medicine. Mortar and pestle, the iconic tool of the apothecary. Heavy stone, bronze, or ceramic bowls with matching pestles, used to grind dried herbs, crush roots, and blend powders into fine, usable forms. The rhythmic sound of pestle against mortar was the heartbeat of the shop. Steady, patient, and reassuring. Even today, the mortar and pestle remains the symbol of pharmacy, echoing back to these medieval benches. Jars, vials, and flask shelves were lined with ceramic jars, often painted with Latin names or symbols. Glass vials held syrups and tinctures, sealed with wax or cork. Larger flasks contained vinegar, wine, or honey used as bases for remedies. The jars themselves were works of art, brightly glazed, decorated with flowers, animals, or astrological signs. They weren't just containers. They were advertisements of knowledge and trust. Furnaces and alembicsy in the back room. Apothecaries kept small furnaces for distillation. Alembics, curved glass or copper vessels, were used to distill waters and essential oils. Rose water, lavender water, and herbal distillates were prized both as medicines and as luxuries. This was the apothecary's alchemy corner, where science, craft, and a little mystery blended together. Books and formulas alongside jars and tools. Apothecaries kept handwritten books of recipes. Some were copied from great authorities like Avicenna or Galen. Others were local collections of tried and true remedies. Margins were often filled with notes, adjustments, observations, or warnings. These books were treasures, passed down from master to apprentice, growing thicker with each generation. The atmosphere of tools, imagine stepping into the shop. The clink of weights on a scale, the scrape of pestle against mortar, the faint hiss of a furnace. In the back room, shelves of jars, each one a little world of possibility. The tools weren't just instruments, they were part of the ritual. Their sounds, their shapes, their presence gave patients confidence that something real, something tangible was being done. Knives, sifts, and spatulas apothecaries kept small. Sharp knives for slicing roots and barks into thin strips before drying. Fine sieves and cloth strainers were used to separate powders from coarse fragments, ensuring smooth mixtures. Spatulas, often made of bone, wood, or brass, helped scoop powders and stir ointments. These humble tools rarely appear in paintings, but they were the quiet workhorses of the trade. Labels and inscriptions, jars and vials were often marked with Latin names, astrological symbols, or even coded signs to protect secret recipes. Some apothecaries used color-coded ribbons or wax seals to distinguish between remedies. Labels weren't just practical, they were part of the mystique. A jar inscribed with a strange symbol felt more powerful, even if it only held dried thyme. The soundscape of the shop, the clink of weights on a scale, the grind of pestle against mortar, the bubble of a syrup simmering over a small flame, the rustle of parchment as recipes were consulted. For patients, these sounds were reassuring. They meant work was being done, remedies were being prepared, and order was being imposed on illness. The scent of tools at work, grinding mint released sharp freshness, crushing cloves filled the air with warmth. Distilling rosewater left a sweet, floral haze. Mixing vinegar tinctures stung the nose with sharpness. The tools didn't just shape medicine, they shaped the sensory memory of the apothecary's world. The symbolism of tools, the mortar and pestle, became a symbol of transformation. Raw nature turned into healing. The scales symbolized balance, not just of weight, but of humors, of health itself. The jars symbolized mystery, closed worlds of knowledge, waiting to be opened. The books symbolized continuity, knowledge passed down, preserved, and expanded. These tools weren't just instruments. They were emblems of trust, of craft, of the fragile line between science and magic. The apothecary's tools as extensions of the self for the apothecary. Tools weren't just objects, they were extensions of their craft and identity. The mortar and pestle carried the weight of tradition. The scales represented fairness and precision. The jars embodied secrecy and trust. Each tool was a companion in the daily work of transforming raw nature into something that could heal. The atmosphere they created the shop was alive with these instruments. The clink of weights reassured customers that their medicine was measured honestly. The grind of pestle against mortar promised transformation. The glow of furnaces hinted at hidden alchemy. The sight of shelves lined with jars gave the impression of endless knowledge. Together, these tools created an environment where healing felt possible, even when remedies were uncertain. The apprentices, beginning most apprentices, were boys, sometimes as young as 12. Though in some towns, daughters of apothecaries also learned the trade quietly at home. They were usually bound by contract to a master, apothecary for 5 to 7 years, in exchange for food, lodging, and training. They worked long hours in the shop, often sleeping in cramped quarters above the counter. The daily grind apprentices started with the simplest tasks: sweeping floors, fetching water, chopping wood for the furnace. They gathered herbs in fields and forests, learning to recognize plants by leaf, stem, and smell. They dried, sorted, and labeled bundles, slowly memorizing the properties of each dot. Only after years of menial work were they trusted with grinding powders, mixing ointments, or measuring ingredients on the delicate scales. Learning the knowledge, much of the training was oral, recipes, rules, and rituals passed down by word of mouth. Apprentices copied recipes into notebooks, often in cramped Latin or local dialects. They studied the great authorities, Galen, Avicenna, Dioscorides, but also learned local lore, which herbs grew best in nearby fields, which remedies the townsfolk trusted most. They were taught not just medicine, but also trade, how to price remedies, how to deal with customers, how to guard secrets. Tests of skill masters sometimes tested apprentices by asking them to identify herbs blindfolded, using only smell or touch. They might be asked to prepare a standard remedy, say a syrup of violets, and judged on taste, texture, and consistency. Mistakes could be costly. Too much of one herb could turn a remedy poisonous. Too little could make it useless. The path to mastery after years of training. Apprentices could become journeymen, traveling to other towns to learn new techniques. Eventually, they might open their own shop if they could afford the jars, scales, and licenses. Some inherited their master's shop, especially if they married into the family. Others never rose beyond assistant, spending their lives grinding, measuring, and serving behind someone else's counter. The human side life as an apprentice was hard. Long hours, little pay, constant discipline. But it was also a path to respectability. To be an apothecary was to be part of a guild, to have a trade, to be trusted with the health of your neighbors. For many, it was a way to rise above the uncertainty of peasant life. And, for the master, apprentices were more than helpers, they were the future. Each one carried the knowledge forward, ensuring that the jars would never be empty, the mortar never silent, the remedies never forgotten. The master-apprentice bond, the relationship, was often strict, but it could also be deeply formative. A master wasn't just a teacher, he was a guardian, disciplinarian, and role model. Apprentices lived under his roof, ate at his table, and followed his rules. Some masters were kind and patient, others harsh and demanding. Either way, the apprentice's life was shaped by this authority. The hardships of apprenticeship days were long, dawn to dusk. With little rest, apprentices often suffered blistered hands from grinding, sore backs from hauling water and wood, and weary eyes from copying recipes by candlelight. Mistakes were punished, sometimes with fines, sometimes with humiliation, sometimes with dismissal. Yet, enduring these hardships was seen as proof of dedication. Only those who persevered could hope to become masters themselves. The hidden curriculum beyond herbs and recipes. Apprentices learned secrets of the trade, how to stretch expensive ingredients without being caught, how to flatter wealthy customers while still serving the poor, how to guard recipes from rivals, sometimes even writing them in code. They also learned diplomacy, how to navigate between physicians, surgeons, and guild inspectors, all of whom might challenge their authority. Fellowship among apprentices often formed bonds with one another, sharing knowledge, complaints, and dreams of future shops in larger towns. Apprentices from different masters might meet at markets or guild events, trading gossip and comparing techniques. These friendships sometimes blossomed into partnerships later in life, when two former apprentices pooled resources to open a shop together. The apprentice's dream for many. The dream was simple: to one day have their own shop, their own jars, their own apprentices, to step out from under a master's shadow and hang their own sign above a door. That dream kept them grinding, fetching, copying, and enduring through the long years of training. The apprentice's journey as a thread the life of an apprentice was long, difficult, and often thankless. Yet it was also the thread that kept the apothecary's world alive. Every jar of herbs, every recipe copied, every bundle gathered in the fields was part of a chain stretching back generations. Apprentices weren't just learning, they were preserving. The human cost and reward the cost, years of labor, little freedom, and the constant weight of discipline. The reward, a trade, a place in society, and the chance, if fortune allowed, to one day stand behind their own counter, with their own jars, their own apprentices, their own reputation. For many, that dream was enough to endure the grind. We've seen the apprentices grinding away, the tools clinking, the jars glowing in candlelight. Now we'll drift into the guilds and regulations. The structures that shaped the apothecary's world kept them in check. and sometimes set them at odds with physicians and surgeons. The rise of guilds by the late Middle Ages, apothecaries were no longer just lone shopkeepers. They were members of guilds. Guilds were powerful organizations that regulated trades, set standards, and protected their members. For apothecaries, guilds meant legitimacy. To belong was to be recognized as a professional, not just a peddler of herbs. Guilds also gave apothecaries a voice in civic life, allowing them to petition city councils, defend their rights, and sometimes even influence laws. Rules and regulations. Guilds enforced strict rules. Remedies had to be prepared according to approved recipes. Weights and measures had to be honest, and shops had to be inspected. Inspectors could walk in unannounced, checking jars for adulterated ingredients or spoiled herbs. Penalties for fraud were severe. Fines, public shaming, or even expulsion from the guild. These rules weren't just about protecting patients. They were about protecting the reputation of the trade itself. Rivalries with physicians and physicians trained at universities often looked down on apothecaries as mere shopkeepers. They wanted to prescribe remedies but not prepare them. Apothecaries, however, argued that they had the practical knowledge of herbs and preparation. Surgeons, meanwhile, competed in another arena, treating wounds and injuries that apothecaries sometimes also claimed to heal. These rivalries led to constant disputes. Who had the right to diagnose? Who could prescribe? Who could sell what? In some cities, compromises were struck. Physicians prescribed, apothecaries prepared, surgeons cut. But in practice, the lines were always blurred. The apothecary's place in society, despite rivalries, apothecaries carved out a respected niche. They were seen as practical, accessible, and essential, unlike physicians, who often charged high fees. Apothecaries were within reach of ordinary townsfolk. Their guilds gave them protection, their shops gave them visibility, and their remedies gave them influence. The guild hall as a second home. The guild hall was more than an office. It was a place of belonging. Here, apothecaries gathered for meetings, feasts, and ceremonies. Apprentices were formally admitted, journeymen promoted, and masters sworn in under candlelight and oaths. The hall itself often displayed symbols of the trade, painted mortar, carved pestles, or even astrological signs linking medicine to the heavens. Ceremonies and oaths new members swore to uphold honesty, to avoid fraud, and to protect the secrets of the craft. Oaths often invoked both God and the saints, binding medicine to faith. Breaking these oaths wasn't just a professional failure. It was a moral one, punishable by fines, expulsion, or public shame. Politics and power guilds weren't just about herbs. They were about influence. They lobbied city councils for favorable laws, defended their right to sell certain remedies, and sometimes clashed with physicians' colleges. In some cities, guilds even regulated prices, ensuring that no apothecary undercut another. This gave the trade stability, but also made it rigid. Innovation could be stifled if it threatened the guild's order. Solidarity and rivalry within the guild. Apothecaries supported one another, sharing knowledge, defending members in disputes, and caring for widows and orphans of the trade. Yet rivalry simmered too. Members competed for wealthy patrons, accused each other of cutting corners, and sometimes spied on one another's recipes. The guild was both shield and battlefield, a place of unity and competition all at once. The apothecary's identity too belonged to a guild, was to be more than a shopkeeper. It was to be part of a recognized profession. The guild gave apothecaries dignity, authority, and a sense of pride. It also gave them a collective identity, not just individuals grinding herbs in dim shops, but members of a brotherhood and occasionally sisterhood bound by rules, rituals, and shared purpose. We've seen the guilds, the apprentices, the tools, and the rhythms of the year. Now we'll step into the intersection of apothecaries and faith. Because in the Middle Ages, medicine was never just about herbs and powders. It was also about prayers, blessings, and the ever-present hand of the Church. The Church and healing, the medieval Church, was deeply entwined with medicine. Monasteries kept herb gardens, copied medical texts, and dispensed remedies to the sick. Apothecaries often borrowed from this tradition, blending herbal knowledge with spiritual practices. Many remedies began with a prayer or blessing, invoking saints like Saint Rock Protector against plague or Saint Apollonia, patron of toothaches. Prayers and charms remedies were sometimes accompanied by spoken words. A psalm recited as a tonic was swallowed, or a charm whispered as a poultice was applied. Patients often requested both herb and prayer, believing the two worked best together. Written charms, small slips of parchment with holy words, were worn around the neck, sold by apothecaries alongside jars of herbs. Suspicion and boundaries. The Church supported healing, but it also drew lines, remedies that leaned too heavily on astrology. Alchemy or pagan practices could be condemned as superstition, or worse, witchcraft. Apothecaries had to tread carefully, balancing practical medicine with spiritual legitimacy. Too much prayer, and they looked like priests. Too much astrology, and they risked accusations of sorcery. Faith as medicine for patients. Faith was inseparable from healing. Illness was often seen as both physical and spiritual. A remedy of rosemary might ease the body, but a blessing eased the soul. The apothecary's role was not just to provide herbs, but to reassure patients that God's will was being honored in the process.